fellow at the China Observatory at the Council on Geostrategy.
You previously worked at the Taipei representative office in the UK.
Yes, exactly, in the economic division.
Thank you. And Andrew Yi?
Hi, Andrew Yi, Executive Director at the China Strategic Risk Institute.
Thank you. Previously Secretariat Manager at the Interparliamentary Alliance on China.
That's correct.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming in. We've got some questions for you. Is it all right if we kick off straight away? So I wondered if I could ask Mr. Kynge, how does the Chinese Communist Party use foreign information manipulation and interference as part of its broader geopolitical strategy? We hear a lot about Russia, but I think for perhaps some people watching this, they may not fully appreciate the extent to which what China's activities are.
Thank you very much. Yes. I'd say there's a number of parts to this. I'll try and be brief. First of all, China has a very clear and explicit propaganda regime. Xi Jinping calls it telling China's story well. The Chinese Communist Party has several very powerful organs that are dedicated towards propaganda. And in Chinese, they use the word propaganda, 宣传. In English, they use the word publicity. But it's absolutely clear to any reader of Chinese that these are propaganda organizations aimed at telling China's story well, whether that be internally or externally. But what I would say, and I think this is important to create a context around this, is that China's appeal in the world, which I believe is making headway, is not solely dependent on propaganda, and it's not solely dependent on disinformation, which, as I see it, is a subset of China's propaganda effort. It's also based on some quite objective advantages that China has. Its economic growth, its ascent to probably the level of peer competitor in terms of technology now with the US, which means that it, with the US, is leading the world in technology. It also derives from China's status as one of the world's biggest investors, the world's biggest trader, the world's leading industrial power. So what I'm trying to say is that the following that China obtains around the world is based objectively on China's performance, as well as on Chinese propaganda, and as a subset of that, Chinese disinformation.
I think that's a very important point, and one for us to absolutely take on board. But I think that we also, because we think about countries who try to use their main way of influencing is through disinformation, perhaps the disinformation arm of what it is that China is doing is overlooked, which is why we wanted to specifically focus on it today. I wondered, is there I'm parking your very important point and just trying to get back to the disinformation point. In what way does China behave differently to other state actors who are well known for being for using disinformation, so like Russia or Iran? What's the difference in approach?
I'm not an expert on Russia and Iran, but from what I've read, I would say China's disinformation approach is pretty much spans the waterfront. It's a very concerted, it's a sort of whole of government approach backed by very strong Chinese government organizations. And I think probably Taiwan is one of the best examples of Chinese disinformation in play, and I'm sure the other speakers have been looking at this as well. But there are official readings on this and NGO readings on this, but the Taiwan National Security Bureau says that disinformation messages from China to Taiwan were 2.15 million in number in 2024, compared to 1.32 million the year earlier. The aim of these attempts was to sow distrust in the Taiwan government, sow distrust towards the US, sow distrust towards Taiwan's armed forces, and distrust towards President Lai Ching-te. You can see Chinese...
Give us an example.
Sorry?
I mean, what sort of thing are we talking about?
Well,
give us the number.
Sure.
And that's quite striking, but can you
right.
just give us an
Yeah. So there's a very interesting NGO in Taiwan called Taiwan Fact-Checked Center, and this is purely devoted to disinformation coming from China. It's freely available online. So, for instance, the messages will say things like, the Taiwan military is weak, Taiwan has started drafting women into its army because it's so desperate, because none of the men want to join up, and the mothers are crying for their sons that are being drafted. It says the US has suspected...
And where do these messages come from? I mean, are they... For those of us who kind of think of it through the prism of the kind of messages that we get, is this through social media?
Well, this is across the panoply of different media. So some of it comes from Chinese state media, which, as you know, directly reports to the Communist Party of China, nice. And some of it comes through Twitter, some of it comes through Facebook, some of it comes through other social media. Of course, China has its own social media, which is accessible to those who read Chinese, such as those people in Taiwan. So it's really across the spectrum. There's a whole list of Chinese disinformation messages regarding the UK, and particularly regarding Hong Kong.
What do they
as
say?
well.
What do they say about us?
Okay, so there are several claims. This got quite hot during the demonstrations in Hong Kong, and then subsequently during the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong. So one claim was that the UK supports Hong Kong independence, which is clearly not true. The joint declaration makes that absolutely clear. There's another claim that the Sino-British Joint Declaration was a historical document. This comes from China News, which is an official Chinese media. Of course, that's demonstrably not true based on the treaties that the UK and Hong Kong have signed. It says that Hong Kong, this came from Xinhua news agency, which is the main news agency of the Chinese Communist Party, says that Hong Kong is an internal matter only for China, which again is against both the basic law of Hong Kong and the Joint Declaration of Hong Kong. There's a claim which came from CCTV that the West does not criticize the US over police brutality and therefore is guilty of double standards. Well, this is not true. There's been plenty of criticisms of the US over police brutality, as we all know. I could go on and on.
No, I think we got the gist of it.
Yeah. So I would summarize this, and maybe the other speakers will disagree, but I would summarize this as part of the intent is to sort of whittle away at perhaps some of the perceptions and understandings that form the pillars of Western democracies, and to create confusion where confidence, once was. That's probably a personal sense of this, but I've been reporting on China for 40 years, and so my sense of it is that this quite often this is an attempt to create confusion rather than to knock down these pillars, as it were. Yeah.
Yes, I see. Afra.
Thank you. So maybe to you, Grace Theodoulou, just picking up on what James King was saying, how do you see China's using state-backed media and social media to influence and shape global narratives?
So I think it's important to understand that China uses a combination of truths, half-truths, lies, and omission in its disinformation campaigns. And they use this in combination with state-backed media, pushing out specific narratives. Then you have Chinese diplomats retweeting, resharing these narratives, and also thousands upon thousands of fake accounts by Chinese bots, often paid for and coordinated by Chinese PR firms. So what you have is this combination of state, non-state, companies retweeting, pushing out these narratives. So it can be quite hard to trace. If you don't know very well the situation, it can be quite hard to trace what's a state narrative and what's supposedly an independent narrative. Can you repeat the second part of your question?
Well, it was kind of thinking about how they're trying to shape global narratives. So obviously they're using, social media, bots, etc. But are you seeing particular themes coming through or kind of methods that they're using?
Yes, so some of the themes that come up again and again is that the so-called West, so predominantly the US, which is its main target, the UK and other Western countries, are unstable, we're troublemakers, we're neo-colonialist. That's one aspect. Then in regards to Ukraine specifically, of course they say that they don't condone what happened, but then they share a lot of the Russian narratives that NATO was provocative and all these things. So they have certain stock phrases and some narratives that they repeat over and over again. And what's slightly concerning is that China Global Television Network, CGTN, which is the more televisual element that Xinhua feeds into that, they broadcast their TV channels in the 6 UN languages around the world. So, it's not like these narratives are being pushed in Chinese and in English only. They've got an extensive global audience, and this is of particular importance in the global south, which is kind of the battleground for influence.
Thank you.
Richard.
Ask, and this is a question for you, Andrew, how does China mask its influence operations through companies, through bilateral partnerships, and through cultural institutions?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. So we have seen a lot of disinformation come through official Chinese channels, as the others have highlighted, so through the state media organizations, through diplomats and so on. But actually, I think if we look at some of the most innovative, effective, and wide-reaching Chinese disinformation content, that's not through traditional media forms or through official diplomatic channels. That is through YouTube Shorts, TikTok, social media, and so on. So what we have seen over the last few years is a plethora of smaller media organizations with much more ambiguous ties to the party state, but who are able to very effectively get their message out on these platforms. And it's increasingly difficult for social media companies to keep track and to close them down, or if they do close them down, then they reappear under a separate heading. So, for example, some might set up initially in Taiwan, try and spread Chinese propaganda there, get closed down in Taiwan, move to Hong Kong, and they're still able to present that. So I think we are seeing a broader grey zone in terms of media organizations with ambiguous links to the Chinese state. And then I think the other way is really emphasizing what has been raised already around this isn't just about disinformation in terms of falsehoods. This is about information manipulation and amplification of narratives which are beneficial to the Chinese government. So, for example, Taiwan is a thriving democracy. There are a plethora of views like the UK. China doesn't necessarily have to create its own content that's critical of the Taiwanese government or seeks to undermine whoever's in government at that time, but it's simply able to use the thousands of fake accounts, these dubious media organizations, to retweet, repost, comment on, drive up this content through the social media algorithms and achieve a much greater influence over the narrative than it otherwise would have done. So I think that's the challenge when we're talking about non-official and non-state actors when it comes to China's disinformation.
It reminds me of a story someone told me about radio stations that may be completely bland, perhaps have really, really good football coverage, and they get huge listenership. I think it was in relation to South America, actually, but I think I just wonder if it might apply elsewhere. And then at a particular crucial moment, there may be a particular bit of news, and at that point it switches and becomes very pro-Chinese, and then goes back again to just talking about football. I mean, is that just one hypocritical story, I'm told, or does that fit within a pattern?
That's absolutely right, and I think that's particularly important within one of the targets of China's information operations, which is what they term as the Global South, or kind of developing countries, which China wants to assert its leadership of globally. So you'll see companies like CGTN, which was mentioned earlier, Xinhua News Agency, they have agreements with local media organizations in places like Kenya, Ghana, Indonesia, and they're content sharing agreements. So the agreement is every once in a while, you will broadcast this story from the Chinese media. And that, I think, is where you begin to have, 90% of the time, it's ordinary local coverage, it's very accessible to local audiences, and then suddenly you'll get a snippet from the Chinese media section. I would also add that these Chinese...
And so the local radio station becomes financially viable because it gets support from China?
That's right, yeah.
I see.
And I think what you'll also find is that compared to some of the Western news organizations like the BBC or CNN, the Chinese organizations are much better at establishing local offices in the region and using journalists who are local as well. So it becomes a much more easily accessible format for some of those audiences to engage with.
Phil, I just wanted to cover.
Just a very quick question. We've talked about social media a lot. We've talked about radio. We've talked about television. One of the things that truly shocked me when I first came to this place was seeing that MPs were receiving China Daily in their post bag, a government-owned newspaper run by the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda arm, which is now gladly stopped.
Did anybody read it, though?
I don't know. I can't speak for other members. I certainly did not.
Didn't even open it.
But to what extent is the Chinese Communist Party also using printed publications akin to China Daily to pursue that agenda?
I think that is an issue, but I would actually push back a little bit and say, well, actually there are bigger issues. I mean, China Daily, you can look it up online and very quickly find out that it is a Chinese government-supported publication. And actually the number of people engaging with printed media is declining, as you know. So I do think it's absolutely right to look at China Daily and look at its influence in the UK, whether that's in Parliament or outside of Parliament. But I would actually be much more concerned by China's ability to amplify and control the narrative on social media by retweeting, reposting stories which fit within its narrative. And because they're amplifying rather than creating their own content, it's not the case that you can just look up a certain individual and say, well, they're clearly linked to the Chinese state, because they might not be. But the 50,000 accounts which retweeted him might be linked to the Chinese state. And that's much more insidious, much more difficult to pin down, and also much harder to regulate and respond to.
Thank you. Alex?
Thanks. It was interesting hearing some of the examples of Chinese misinformation that you were giving around the decadent West, like culture wars and the NATO being a big threat to Russia and Ukraine and the like. I mean, those are also the narratives that we hear the Russians are pushing. So is there any evidence that China and Russia, or maybe other actors, are coordinating these disinformation campaigns, or are they just jumping on the back of each other? I mean, maybe Grace.
Yeah, so far it seems like the cooperation between China and Russia has been quite opportunistic and on specific common interests that they have. But what's interesting is that on the 1st of September, just as Putin was arriving in China for the big military parade, a very large private media conglomerate in Russia has just shared a media cooperation agreement with Xinhua News. So I think we might be about to see stronger, more systemic cooperation between China and Russia. And there have been other instances where, Russia pushes a certain narrative, their diplomats retweet, reshare this content on social media, then it's shared further in China, and there's this kind of cross-pollination a lot of the time between the two. So it's not like so far there's been specific agreements written in place, but it's just whenever their interests converge, there's definitely amplification there.
And is that's increasing, you're saying? They're kind of learning from each other and the successes?
It's increasing, and one really important thing which I think we need to keep an eye out for is that the Russian narrative, for example, around Ukraine, is that it was a denazification campaign. and against fascism and all these things. And the language, the words we're seeing, China's really pushing that around the anti-fascist war, basically the Second World War after the Japanese surrender. They keep saying, China and Russia and their joint statements together, we were two of the key countries in fighting fascism. So we're seeing these words repeated over and over again. And of course, on the surface, fighting fascism is a great thing, right? But if you don't always know the context and the complexities of each situation, specifically in countries where they might not know the history that well, the lines get confused again, and suddenly you have China and Russia seeming like these greatly benevolent countries working together to fight this awful thing.
Yeah.
Mr. King referred to the volume of Chinese disinformation in Taiwan in the run-up to the Taiwanese election. Can you, Andrew, and perhaps the others too, talk about the main targets for Chinese disinformation, Taiwan being a clear one, but also the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tibet? Are these all sort of mass disinformation subjects? And can you give us sort of some examples of that happening?
So yeah, I do think Taiwan is in a slightly different category to the others. I mean, Taiwan, we're not just talking about telling China's story well, which was mentioned earlier. We're talking about warfare, and if you look at PLA military strategy, it divides political warfare into public opinion warfare, lawfare, and psychological warfare. So there's kind of all of these components which are coming into place in Taiwan. In terms of other targets, so I do think a really key one to focus on.
Sorry, before you move on.
Yeah.
In the run-up to the election in 24, do you mind also just explaining what was going on?
Sure. So I think you see a number of dominant narratives in Taiwan at that time. So one is discrediting individuals who are aligned with the DPP, which is traditionally pro-independence, or otherwise other individuals who are generally anti-Beijing in some way.
The different political
so
parties
for example,
the different political parties with different emphasis, and there was an attempt to discredit the political party or the individuals within the political party who were more in favour of independence from China than perhaps their rivals. Yeah.
Exactly. So, for example, President Lai, president-elect at the time, the candidate at the time, there are a series of deepfake videos which purported to show him admitting that the opposition parties actually represented the country's interests better than he did. There were a series of deepfake explicit sexual images circulating the internet around certain DPP politicians as well. So some of it is quite personal. I think more broadly there is an element of just simply trying to portray Taiwan as a failed state, so not necessarily looking at individuals or parties, but trying to discredit the government as a whole. So that's both creating falsehoods. For example, most recently, this is more recent, this wasn't the 2024 election, but we saw there was some false information going around how many undersea cables around Taiwan have been cut. The false information said there were 9, in reality there's 3. So there's all of these efforts to kind of embarrass the Taiwanese government, show that it's not fit for purpose, and that is seen as serving China's interests. The other dominant narrative around the 2024 election was US skepticism. So this is trying to persuade the Taiwanese public that the US can't be relied upon. So, for example, there was disinformation around the Taiwanese government harvesting organs and blood and selling them to the US. There was disinformation on the US poisoning pork and exporting it to Taiwan. But also kind of issue amplification in that where there are legitimate concerns with the US position on Taiwan from a Taiwanese perspective, those issues were being amplified by some of these fake accounts. It's kind of US skepticism, discrediting individuals and undermining the state. I think those are the key tenets of the Taiwan strategy.
Right, thank you.
And could you go on with some examples of other subjects of Chinese disinformation?
Sure. I mean, so the Global South has already been mentioned. I think the other key one I would highlight would be the Chinese diaspora globally. And the Chinese Communist Party thinks about this very broadly. So by its own estimates, there are 40 to 60 million of what it calls overseas Chinese. Yeah. This doesn't just mean kind of people with PRC passports or people born in mainland China. This includes kind of anyone with Chinese linguistic, cultural, or ethnic heritage. And China sees the diaspora as both a vulnerability and an opportunity. I think in terms of the vulnerability, it is extremely worried about activists and dissidents within the diaspora. We've seen that in terms of some of the disinformation spread about Hong Kong activists in the UK, for example. So you may have seen on the news last week, there was a deep fake video circulating, purporting to show Hong Kongers, some of them in the UK, having a conversation which was in fact faked. But they also see the diaspora as an opportunity. So the idea that some of these groups which may be more friendly to China might be able to help spread good messages about China, might be able to help exert political influence. And so within that diaspora, we're not just talking about mainland Chinese, we are also talking about Hong Kongers. They view Taiwan as part of this diaspora as well. So that would be the other key group that I would focus on.
Forgive me for jumping in again. I mean, it just reminds me of when I went to Australia and I was told that there was a social media platform that was used largely by the Australian Chinese community, and so there was messages going into that, and it was sort of unknown to mainstream Australian political thinking because they didn't speak Chinese and they didn't have an entry into it, so they had no idea the extent to which people were being manipulated. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think we see this phenomena both on kind of the mainstream platforms that we're all used to, whether that's YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, but also, there are specific platforms which are popular within the Chinese communities, Weibo, WeChat, Xiaohongshu, and so on. And some of those are Chinese entities, so they're much easier for the Chinese government to not only spread disinformation, but also conduct surveillance, collect data, and so on. And so, they're definitely monitoring those is a real challenge as well.
And who is the target of this? Is it principally Chinese diaspora, or are they seeking to influence just public opinion generally?
So I think it's both. I think the Chinese diaspora is a unique target audience. So there, it's about neutralizing any opposition that there might be to the Chinese Communist Party rule, but also persuading them that the Chinese Communist Party is the one legitimate ruler of China, that if they have some kind of Chinese heritage, they owe something to the Chinese Communist Party and they should adhere to the Chinese Communist Party in some way. I think the case for broader influence in UK society as a whole, it's interesting. There does seem to be an effort both with Russian and Chinese state media to platform individuals on the political extremes. So, for example, far-right German AfD MPs and MEPs will often appear both in kind of Chinese state media and in Russian state media. And I do worry and suspect that kind of as our own political debate in the UK becomes more polarised, there will be an attempt by China to platform those on either extreme in an effort to kind of make our governance less effective, our debate more polarised, and therefore as a society becoming weaker.
That leads on to what Uma was going to ask. Uma.
Thank you. It's been a really fascinating session. Last year we heard evidence from BBC World Service, including the current Director General of the BBC, and he said that the world faces an all-out assault on the truth. And this was in relation to both Chinese and Russian state media buying up airwaves where BBC World Service had previously broadcast. And he said that it led to the rise in the Middle East of people hearing unchecked propaganda. What role do you think civil society, independent media and academia play in building resilience against Chinese or other foreign disinformation manipulation? I'll start with James.
I think there could be a major role. Again, I go back to the example of Taiwan. Taiwan being on the front lines of this, of Chinese disinformation campaigns, has really sharpened up its act. And so you do have organizations like the Taiwan fact-checking one that I mentioned. And I think this really is an attempt to increase the China literacy of the population so that people can go somewhere that's trusted to check whatever allegation has been made or whatever rumor is now circulating in social media channels. So to me, there is a very clear need in democracies for this type of resilience effort. You might call it fact-checking. You could have government leadership perhaps, or you could have government direction. But it does seem to me to be a crucial issue, given the fact that we're not only talking about China, we're talking about Russia, Iran, there are plenty of other players around, and the way in which people consume information these days is so vastly different from what it was even 10 years ago, with people having kind of personally tailored sources of information largely coming through social media. So, yeah, I think it's key. The other thing I just mentioned is that China's also moving to export its censorship regime. And I'm not only talking about software, I'm talking about hardware. There was a leak of information picked up by Wired magazine recently, in fact last week, that showed that China is exporting what's called the Great Firewall. That's shorthand for its censorship regime in terms of the hardware and the software that backs it. And a list of countries have already bought this censorship package: Kazakhstan, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Myanmar, and another that wasn't identified. And what the censorship regime allows these countries to do is not only to filter the messages that are going through to its people using this Chinese software, but also to monitor individuals, monitor the browsing habits of individuals. And in the case of Myanmar, it turned out, according to these leaked documents that came from the China security state, 81 million Myanmar citizens were being monitored consecutively, simultaneously at any one moment. So this is a highly sophisticated infrastructural capability that China is now exporting around the world, again to the global south primarily, which, as Andrew's already mentioned, is the prime target for China's, the export of China's security, censorship state. Yeah.
That's really remarkable. I mean, are leaks like this common?
Very uncommon.
That's what I thought.
Very uncommon.
Because of time, do you mind if I go to Richard next and then come back to you, Phil?
Happy to. How might algorithmic manipulation and censorship on these Chinese platforms that we're discussing contribute to the spread of disinformation? What you've just described, Mr. King, is the export of this software.
Yes.
But in particular, what effect might that have when we think about algorithmic manipulation?
If I can answer this question first. So the most important example here, I think, is TikTok, which Google analysis shows for Gen Z is the most important, the most used search engine. So that's where they get most of their information from. And we've seen examples of algorithmic manipulation here where effectively if you try and search something like Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong on TikTok, very CCP favourable narratives come up, so saying how wonderful life is in Tibet and Xinjiang and all these things. So that's something we really need to look at. And in the case of the US, one of the biggest concerns is that we saw yesterday there's been an initial deal signed for the transfer of TikTok, but the algorithm is probably the most useful tool here for the CCP on this issue, because this way it's such a powerful tool for them to develop their soft power and China's image. And I also wanted to briefly answer Sir John Whittingdale's question specifically on Xinjiang and Tibet and the disinformation there, is I think it's important to categorize the disinformation campaigns into the battles China thinks it's already won, so Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and then the issues it's yet to conquer, so Taiwan, South China Sea. So when it comes to Xinjiang and Tibet, their main goal there is those people are already subjugated, right? Their main goal there is to change the narrative abroad. So to push this narrative that, yeah, everything's fine, there were never any issues, it's a happy, prosperous society. And one of the things they do there is they recruit Western academics, business people to write op-eds in the Global Times. The Global Times is the mouthpiece of the CCP, saying that they visited these places in person and everyone's really happy. They're doing these lovely folk dances. Everything's great. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I think we should be more concerned by Chinese platforms because they could be more resistant to compliance and they could be more open to influence from the Chinese government. But it's not just about Chinese platforms.
Do you call TikTok a Chinese platform?
I would, yeah, because it's, the parent company is ultimately owned by China.
In Singapore, they've told.
Yeah, but if you look at the board structures and so on, then it's clearly a Chinese company. But yeah, I mean, if we look at non-Chinese platforms, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, they're still, I mean, it's not hard to manipulate these algorithms, right? If you have enough fake accounts, if you can generate enough fake content, you can rise to the top of those algorithms. And so it doesn't matter that they're not Chinese companies. China still knows how to play the game, still knows how to make friendly Chinese narratives come to the top of those accounts. And historically, some of those organizations, some of those companies have been very good at removing fake Chinese accounts. We saw Twitter in 2020, Meta, I think, in 2023, remove thousands of fake Chinese accounts. I don't know how long we can rely on tech companies to do that work for us, and unless the government takes an active approach in making sure that tech companies are rooting out fake Chinese accounts or any other country, then we're essentially relying on their goodwill to protect us from some of these excesses.
But given the place of the debate in the United States and the hostility that exists in the US administration towards China, isn't it the case that the US government is going to seek to work with US-based social media companies to try to regulate those areas? So
historically that has been the case. The problem is twofold. Part of the problem is Elon Musk and his ownership of X and his business interests in China through Tesla. Elon Musk historically has had a very close relationship with the Chinese regime, and I would doubt now that X is under Elon Musk's control how forthright they will be in challenging Chinese disinformation. And then the other issue is the way that President Trump sees disinformation. He sees kind of fake news and these other kind of terms that are thrown around as ways to criticize him and criticize his policy. And so there has been a hollowing out within the US around some of the institutions and some of the civil society groups that have taken the lead in combating fake news and combating disinformation. So I do think, again, this is an area where the UK government can step up to the plate when it comes to supporting civil society efforts around the world to combat disinformation and information manipulation, because the US role in that, I think, is going to decline over the next few years.
Just to follow up to that, you've been talking about information manipulation, and earlier we had really alarming example from Myanmar. Would you say that TikTok is a method by which China could monitor UK users of its platform?
If I can give an example from... so in 2022 there was there was an issue in the media about TikTok in the US, and it was found that ByteDance, so the parent company in China, had tracked the location of two US TikTok employees from China to see whether they had been at the same location as these journalists who leaked a certain story to the press. So it is possible for them to track data, and it's possible for them to track that data from China. And once that data is in China, it's possible for it to then be passed on to the CCP, because in China all...
Do you think the UK government should be looking again at TikTok in Britain?
Yeah, I think they should be. I think it's not just the algorithm issue, but it's clear that this data can be accessed from China. So the second it's in China, it can, if the CCP requests that data to go to them, that's possible for that to happen. So I think it's really wise that it's banned on UK Parliament devices and in NATO and a series of other countries as well.
Do the rest of you think that the government should avoid being on TikTok?
I think, what the government decides, I think, is for the government. But my sense of this is that we should have a much clearer understanding of where data goes when you're using a Chinese device. This is the first stop, because, as we know...
This is not a Chinese... Let's say you had TikTok on your phone. What data could the Chinese extract because you have TikTok on your phone?
So as I said, location's one of them, and specifically for the UK, one of the main issues here is the transnational repression, right? So,
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, what you have to ask the question: what's the data they would want to know? Do they really care about some person in the north of England watching cat videos? I don't think that's their main concern here. It's the people who've got a bounty on their heads. Where are they? Who are their associates? Who can then be targeted for bribery and all these things? These are the questions we have to be asking.
Are you on TikTok?
I'm not, no. But yeah, I mean, I think for TikTok and I think for any social media company, really, there are kind of three areas where the UK government should be pressing them on. So one is around censorship and kind of how can we have trust in TikTok and other platforms that they are not conducting censorship on behalf of China or any other state, and how actively can we monitor that and guarantee that? The second is around integrity. So how willing are TikTok and other social media providers to monitor, take down, detect fake accounts, particularly when they are sponsored by states. And the third is, as James mentioned, is around data security. How do we know that sensitive personal data of UK citizens isn't being transferred to authoritarian governments like China? So I think those are three areas to push TikTok on, and those are three areas to push any social media company in the UK on.
Just a brief add to that. I mean, anyone who works in the China space knows that if you have China apps like WeChat, Weibo, Xiaohongshu, and those, you keep them on a separate phone.
Yep.
So we all know that basically all of your data is transparent to the Communist Party of China if you're using any of those Chinese apps.
I mean, for the record, I've just bought a phone for TikTok that I have a separate one because I think that the warnings they're giving today are very serious. Yeah. Phil.
Thanks, Chair. Focusing on how this plays out in the UK, this committee has received evidence calling on the UK government to place China on the enhanced tier for the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. So maybe just starting with Mr. Kynge, what impact do you think that measure would have of placing China on the enhanced tier on its ability to propagate disinformation in the UK? And what practical implications do you think that step would have for UK-based individuals and entities who are working with or on behalf of Chinese state-owned organisations?
I'm not absolutely sure of the implications of that. I think it would obviously increase oversight, but as to the finer details of it, I'd defer to the other panelists.
I'll start with the business side. So from my understanding, if we were to place China on the enhanced tier, it would make a lot of the current ongoing business deals quite difficult to enact. So from my understanding, if let's say you had a Chinese business delegation and some of them were CCP members, you would have to declare everything up to the chauffeur who goes to pick them up from the airport. So obviously that adds a lot of bureaucracy and it's a big hassle. So what would make a bit more sense to me is to almost have a specific mechanism for China, perhaps not FIRS as it currently stands. And in the China audit, they're saying it's the most complex bilateral relationship we have. Well, doesn't that perhaps merit its own framework? Because the way it currently stands, to have China on the enhanced tier, and as I said, adding all this bureaucracy to every single business deal, meanwhile saying we can't do without China, we have to increase business with them, how is that going to work? And then in terms of propagating disinformation, an interesting example is that in the US, in 2019, I believe, they required Xinhua to register with the equivalent, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And 2 years later, they required CGTN, so the more televisual state propaganda outlet, to register. And when they registered, they also had to submit their spending. So we got some figures on exactly how much Chinese state media was spending on propaganda in the US, which was really interesting. And for altogether, it was $64 million in the year of 2020, I believe. And the US was the biggest target in terms of spending for Chinese propaganda.
How much did they spend on us?
I'm not sure about that, but I can get back to you on that. Yeah, if we require them to register, then we'll have some figures.
Mr. Yeah, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on the enhanced tier of furs.
Yeah, I mean, I think China should be on the enhanced tier as a country which is seeking to exert influence in the UK through a number of complex mechanisms, as we've been discussing this morning. But not only that, but also directly threatening UK security interests when it comes to cybersecurity, the safety of Hong Kongers and other diaspora groups here in the UK, and undermining the UK's soft power and influence abroad. So I do think putting it on the enhanced tier would allow for greater transparency. Maybe two areas I'll just highlight quickly. So one is around some of those smaller media groups that we've discussed earlier today. So there is the carve-out within FERS for recognised media providers, right? But actually, I think some of the most insidious information operations are not kind of the very well-established Chinese state media organizations. That is there and that should be tracked. But it is kind of, influencers on YouTube who may be receiving money from the Chinese state to propagate certain messages. They won't be registered as a recognized media provider. And so to what degree is the UK government able to monitor and enforce the foreign influence registration scheme when it comes to some of those smaller, novel, innovative media forms? And I think putting China on the enhanced tier would make it much clearer that actually those operations on behalf of the Chinese state must be registered and must be transparent.
But to be really clear, if you're an influencer on TikTok or another social media platform and you're getting paid to propagate Chinese state messaging, under the first scheme on the enhanced tier, you'd have to register.
So that's my understanding of it. I mean, the key would be whether it qualifies as a political influence activity or not. So, and the degree to which the content that you are propagating is directly commenting on UK politics or not, or directly, calling on members of parliament to vote a certain way or not. I think that would probably where it falls one way or the other. But currently, if you're the People's Daily or China Daily in the UK, you're a recognised media provider. So, by my understanding, you wouldn't need to register separately. You're exempted. But for these kind of smaller influencers, smaller media organisations, they probably aren't registered. And we should know if they are propagating material on behalf of the Chinese state. And I think having China on the enhanced tier would just make that obligation even clearer. I think the second group to highlight would be some of the business lobbies. So the United Front, which is the Chinese Communist Party's influence arm, does have a number of dedicated trade outfits. So, for example, the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce. The Chinese state also has the Chinese Council for Promotion of International Trade. These have direct links with a number of the British Chinese business lobbies here in the UK, some of whom are able to meet with ministers, meet with MPs. And unless China is on that enhanced tier, it's not clear to me that those groups would have an obligation to report that actually they might have arrangements with the Chinese state or the Chinese Communist Party. So again, putting China on that enhanced tier would just allow for more clarity when it comes to some of that business lobbying as well.
You may not be able to answer this. However, one of the points made in the House of Commons yesterday afternoon was that messages are seen and interpreted by China. Do you think that the decision not to proceed with the prosecution of two individuals for Chinese espionage is going to send a message that we are weak and that China will interpret that way?
I don't know enough about the latest update to be able to comment on that, but I would say that the British public at least needs a bit more information as to why these charges have suddenly been dropped.
Just to go back briefly, Andrew, to your point about that have sort of undeclared and unobvious links between China business groups, British business groups, lobbying groups, and so forth. I'm interested in your perspective on whether or not what's being labelled the China Super Embassy for London actually would increase CCP's ability to influence within the UK, whether or not it matters to the capability on the sort of misinformation, disinformation front, having such a large facility in central London, or actually, given their ability to operate online, it's an irrelevance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a question of scale rather than quality. I think kind of all of the operations that China currently conducts in terms of influence, disinformation, information manipulation, to the extent that it needs an embassy to do that. I imagine it can do it from its current embassy, and whether it's one place or another doesn't make too much of a difference. But yeah, if it is the case that the expanded embassy then means you can double the number of staff working on those issues in country, then perhaps you then do see an increase by some factor of some of those efforts. So for me, the embassy doesn't necessarily qualitatively change China's ability to do these campaigns, but maybe in terms of scale, it probably on balance makes things easier. But the others might have dissenting views on that.
I mean, I would agree that I don't think the size of the embassy matters in terms of conducting these campaigns. And regarding the concerns around these sensitive cables being near the site, well, firstly, I have faith in the intelligence services here that they've determined to what extent this is a risk, whether these cables can be moved. But for the cables, that's more that's both espionage and sabotage. And on that, we've seen instances of that have directly affected the UK. So you have Salt Typhoon, which is linked to Chinese state actors, which is mostly espionage, gathering data of the UK and its allies. And then you have Volt Typhoon, which is more about scoping the possibility for critical infrastructure disruption. And only about 3 weeks ago, Division of GCHQ released a report with the allies saying that they've seen further evidence of this, where China's scoping out the capacity to disrupt our critical national infrastructure. So I think we need to ask the questions, why are they doing this? Why are they trying to see what the probability is for that to happen in the UK? And that's where the concerns around the super embassy come in, is in terms of its location. But again, I would defer to the greater experts on that.
Mr. Kynge, before you address that, if you want to, this is the last question. And I think the way the questions have fallen, we haven't heard as much from you as we have from others. And I wondered if there was anything that we should have asked you that we haven't.
No, I mean, I would just sort of return to what I mentioned at the beginning, which is that I think that disinformation, while obviously, as we've discussed, a very real issue and something that China is putting a huge amount of effort into, is only part of China's sort of narrative contest with the West. And there are other parts of the narrative contest, propaganda being one of them, but also China's very real advantages. And China's lobbying efforts with the key stakeholders in our society, both in the government and the big corporations. So I would just like to situate this information in that panoply of efforts that China is making, and in my estimation, making serious headway in. It's just part of a much broader effort, and China appears to be winning this narrative war, I would say, at the moment.
So we were, as a committee, intending to hold the government to account on its China audit, and obviously we waited quite a long time for that audit, and we haven't really seen it. In fact, we've only seen a few pages, which we're told is part of it. And so it's quite difficult for us as a committee to know kind of how we respond to that. But I interpret what you're saying as that you would urge us to do more work on China more generally, because it's such an important force in the world at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, just to really bring it down to brass tacks, in my sense of it is that China represents both a very considerable opportunity, particularly in the areas of trade, investment, potentially even technology investment, but it also represents a very clear security issue. And it seems to me that it's incumbent on all of us to get as clear as possible where the red lines are. If we can get clear where the red lines are, then that will open us up to cooperate in all the areas that we should be cooperating in for mutual benefit, and then circumscribe the other areas as we see fit. But at the moment, it seems to me that the West in general, not just the UK, certainly all the countries of Europe that I've looked at, have not got the red lines clear. And this is a major problem for both sides of the relationship. It prevents clear cooperation, and it prevents us knowing where the vulnerabilities are.
Well, look, on that note, can I thank you all very much for coming today and for giving such fascinating evidence. Thank you very much for your time. And if there's anything that when you've left here you think, oh, I should have added that, please do write in and we can include it in your evidence. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Can we bring in the second panel? Yeah. This morning, the Foreign Affairs Committee is holding a session on the disinformation inquiry. And in the first session, we were joined by experts on China. We're now moving on to the second section, where we have experts on Africa. So I wonder if you could perhaps introduce yourselves, perhaps beginning with Dr. Madrid-Morales.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting us. My name is Dani Madrid-Morales. I'm a lecturer at the University of Sheffield. I lead the Disinformation Research Cluster at the institution. I'm also affiliated with the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, where I am a fellow at the Center for Information Integrity.
Right.
My name is Antonio Giustozzi. I'm a senior research fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Service Institute in Whitehall. And I suppose the reason I'm here is because last year we carried out, I ran a study on Wagner Group in Africa. We also done some work on Russian disinformation, artificial intelligence more recently. So I'm not an Africa specialist, but it happened that I carried out this project on especially parts of Africa, Francophone Africa, specifically on Wagner Group.
Good. Thank you. Can I perhaps begin with a sort of general question? Perhaps if I begin with Dr. Madrid-Morales. So who are the main state and non-state actors conducting information operations in Africa?
So I would start by saying a couple of things. The first one is, even though it's very easy for us to talk about Africa as a whole, right? We cannot think of it as a single place where actors are acting equally. So if I can briefly divide North, East, West, and Southern Africa, obviously the main actors in Western Africa are Russia, to some extent China, and obviously Turkey is a key actor that has entered the space in recent years. In North Africa, Turkey, yeah.
Where are the influences of Turkey?
Quite significant in the West. So they open, you might have been aware of TRT, which is the equivalent of the BBC for Turkey. TRT launched a TRT Africa enterprise in recent years. One of the things that TRT has done, for example, is open local language content in Hausa for Nigerian. And one of the things that TRT did, quite interestingly, they hired most of the BBC Africa team. So
they did what?
They hired BBC Africa journalists. So when TRT opened its office for Nigeria, most of the people working there were taken away from BBC.
Because, yeah. So just so that I'm absolutely clear about this, unfortunately it's a rather familiar story. So,
okay.
So the BBC had an office in Nigeria.
So BBC has its main office in Nairobi. Yeah. That does BBC Africa, which is the operation for the whole continent.
Yes.
And for some local languages, they have local offices. But what I'm talking about here is that TRT opened its Africa venue, and when they went to hire journalists for that new TV station and radio station, the main source of those journalists were BBC journalists that mostly are Nigerians and local other.
Why did they move, do you know?
Probably money.
No, it wasn't because there was any cuts to BBC.
No,
BBC there.
But most of these actors, CGTN that was talked about in the previous session, pays much better than the BBC. Okay. And we've seen that some of the moves that we see on the continent are primarily due to monetary reasons. And I think that it's important to remember that many of the people working for these organizations, whether it's CGTN or RT or TRT, they are not particularly aligned with one government or the other.
Yeah.
It's a matter of money. It's my job, and where do I make more money, and where is my career going to increase in the future?
Sure.
So if I go back to what I was saying at the beginning, right? So the north of Africa is a space where we see a lot of RT, Russia, but also Qatar, the Emirates, generally UAE, and Saudi Arabia with some of its Arab language content. Then East Africa is particularly a China space where China has been very active, while Southern Africa is a bit more complex, primarily because South Africa has such a huge important role in the media space that other actors are really struggling to make inways.
Yeah.
Very briefly.
Yeah. No. I've been given a map. I'm sort of fascinated by this map. I'm just trying to double cross-check it with the evidence you're giving. But we don't have Turkey on it, and so that's perhaps the important additional thing. So if you're able to write in, then we can add your evidence to this map, which I hope that we'll publish in our report. So that you've been talking about state actors. What about non-state actors?
Obviously, a colleague will speak about Wagner Group, which used to be a non-state actor and now has become part of the Russian state a lot more integrally after Prigozhin died / was killed. I would say the main non-state actors are actors affiliated with foreign states that are vehicles or conduits through which some of the operations are done.
The famous one is the Wagner Group.
Correct.
And the Wagner Group now has changed its name.
Correct.
And is now called what?
Africa Corps.
Africa Corps, okay. And it changed its name because there
was it was dissolved when,
about it?
I'll let you speak more to it because it's not my area of expertise, so maybe you want to give context to that.
Do you want to just explain?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, it's a bit of a complex situation, but it's not actually correct to say that Africa Corps replaced Wagner Group. Wagner Group remains a separate entity, but was subsumed under, let's call it Africa Corps, but Africa Corps is only a label, it's only a brand. In fact, it's a department of the Ministry of Defense in Russia, which is tasked with essentially doing contracting out. So basically, they operate not on a typical Russian state contract, but they have a different type of contract, more flexible, so to speak. And the purpose is to attract manpower, if you like, that would not work for the Russian state. The Russian state doesn't have a great reputation in terms of flexibility, and before the Ukrainian war also pay scales. So in order to attract, for example, in our case, quite important, people from the commercial sector, people specializing in information campaigns, for example, they wouldn't work for the Russian state, not on those conditions. So this department is able to offer a different type of contract, more flexible, more money, able to work from home. They don't need to go to an office in the ministry and whatever. So this kind of flexibility, much easier to contract also or subcontract private entities like Wagner Group, but not exclusively. There are other private military companies, other entities that also can be contracted. So it's not only Wagner Group. So Africa Corps at this point incorporates a variety of organizations, but also individuals who have a direct contract with the Ministry of Defense. So not only companies, private companies, but also private individuals. So it's more complex than that. Just to clarify the type of structure.
Okay. Edward.
Well, thank you, Chair. Just to carry on from that a little bit, in terms of how Russia is doing misinformation in Africa, in the areas where it's active, can you explain the sort of what used to be Wagner Group, Africa Corp? What is it? Is that a medium through which it is doing misinformation in Africa, or is that element of it still run out of more traditional state apparatus?
Well, state apparatus are always active, but they tend to specialize more on cyber operations. So the military have expertise in that field. They've been investing on it for many years. And tendentially, is more state-focused. Cyber operations are more state-focused. Doesn't mean that they can't hire if needed, especially when they do like large-scale operations, when they need volume. They can, again, hire ad hoc people from the commercial sector just to have more people involved for certain campaigns that could last, whatever, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. But it's state-led. Whereas but we don't call that disinformation, of course. Cyber is a different thing. With regard to actual, what they call information war, is there is a strong presence of private actors, especially when they operate in unfamiliar context. So for them, for Russia, Eastern Europe is a familiar context for obvious reasons. And they've been always active there. They know the environment quite well. Africa, especially when they started, Russia became interested again in Africa after maybe more than 20 years of neglect. They didn't have any expertise, they didn't have any people on the ground. And of course they wanted to get going pretty quickly. So they wanted to develop a capacity to operate very quickly. So again, this approach, relying on private contractors, turned out to be very useful. So they hire, for example, Africa specialists just to advise on how to organize information operations in Africa. And that was not done, at the time actually there was no Africa Corps, but it was done, it happened that Wagner Group played this kind of role, but it wasn't the Wagner Group, the branch of Wagner Group that was actually sending mercenaries to Africa. It was done in St. Petersburg. They had a branch dedicated to information operations. They started operating elsewhere, but this issue of Africa landed on their desk, and they agreed to do it. And they very quickly they proved that they were flexible and able to adapt. So very quickly they hired some Africa specialists. Then they started hiring African journalists, African media operators. So just to let's say they invested a little bit in trying to understand the new operating environment, which was not familiar to them. And on that basis, they developed an approach. So it was not Africa Corps, it was Wagner Group, but the Wagner Group itself was divided in a number of sub-entities. So not the same entity that was doing mercenary operations, was a separate entity doing media operations, and they themselves extensively subcontract. So they would, for example, in Africa, they would hire, let's call them consultants. People are not organically members of Wagner Group. They might be hired for short periods of time, with any kind of contract in arrangement. So very flexible, essentially like a completely private operation.
Before we ask the next question, because I think I might have missed something. And you said there have been 20 years of neglect by Russia for Africa. So what was it that sparked their interest again, and where particularly are they interested?
Well, the course in general, we could say that for at least 10 years, everything was neglected in Russia. Right? It was a situation of collapse. The money the state had a very limited fiscal revenue to spend on anything. So everything was in a state of neglect, from the nuclear arsenal to everything else. Of course, Africa was not a priority for a long time. The situation changed. I think a turning point was the first Donbass war, because at that point the Russians realized that they are quite isolated diplomatically. But at the same time, they saw that around the world there was potential for earning more diplomatic support if just they were willing to invest a little bit of resources. So Africa looked good because there are a lot of countries in Africa. Mostly they're not very resourceful, so with the limited investment, therefore we can get that can translate into major change in terms of diplomatic support. Or countries that approve of Russia would vote in Russia's favor in the United Nations, in the Assembly, and whatever. So that was the point of departure.
Okay, thank you.
In terms of timelining that, just so we sort of understand where the role of Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation is, because obviously there are countries like Mali where France has been actively asked to leave and been replaced by Russian private military contractors. Is that on the back of concerted efforts in terms of propaganda and disinformation? Is that a pure sort of economic or play? How is the state supporting the expansion of Russian boots on the ground in places like East Africa, West Africa?
Right. I would say it was a multi-dimensional operation. I have to first say that realistically, I think the Central Wagner Group in Africa has been quite realistic in terms of setting objectives. I think they understood that you can manipulate opinion, but up to a certain point, especially if you are an outsider, if you're an external actor. So I think they realized first thing that was obvious when they started looking at, especially West Africa, they realized the French were not very popular there, especially at the elite level. So I think they realized that with the modest investment, they could have strengthened already pre-existing trend. They didn't create it, they didn't invent it, but they positioned themselves in order to be useful to West African elites, especially, as we know, in some countries, in Francophone Africa, Mali in particular, Central Africa, and then later also Niger, etc. Because they realized there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the French. The French had very significant presence on the ground, but the relation with the local governments was not good. It had not been good for quite some time. So they exploited it. You could say some of it is not even about narratives. Much of what the Russians were doing was undermining French narratives. So it's a purely negative target. And much of disinformation it's not about having a narrative, it's about undermining somebody else's narrative. So much of the work goes into that. Of course, it's not always easy to say exactly how much is Russia's work and how much is other actors, because one thing that was clear, even before the Russians appeared, there were a lot of actors doing disinformation in Africa. Not just, of course, foreign ones, we mentioned that, but also local ones. Every ambitious African politician would have some journalists working for him. Of course, more recently, social media are widely used. They all try to undermine each other, and there is a lot of fake news circulating, even without the Russian helping. So, because that environment is not always easy to measure, with precision, the Wagner Group, the reason for the success was not so much they spent a lot of money. I don't think they didn't spend too much, but they were able to attract a number of actors who were already present, media houses, individual journalists, politicians, very importantly, and they gave them capabilities to essentially rise to the top of this information war. So they became more competitive, they were more coordinated, they had more effective propaganda, if you like, than the competition, because the quality of the, if you like, propaganda being circulated before the Russian arrived was modest by our standards. I already mentioned the Wagner Group relies largely, or at least originally relied on people coming from the commercial sector. The Russian commercial sector is very similar to the American one, or even some European ones. It's very competitive, where people or companies really work very hard to undermine each other. But these kind of skills have been transferred to the political field. First in Russia, where even in Russia, of course, there is some political competition, not complete, but politicians do like to win election when they run. So they do rely also on disinformation internally against each other, but largely it was exported to be deployed places like Africa in this case, but also elsewhere. So this kind of skills and techniques were definitely well above the pre-existing standard in Africa. So they brought in new know-how, if you like.
Yeah. Just to expand on that slightly, Dr. Madrid-Morales, a lot of the state actors that you outlined at the beginning would not be described as democratic states. Those politicians that we're seeing then rising to the forefront in Africa, often backed by military contractors, Russian military contractors, tend to be non-democratic actors. So the broader question here is, to what extent is Russian disinformation, Russian propaganda, but also other state actors fundamentally undermining democracy, public health, civil society groups on the continent?
It's difficult to establish a causal link between the two. Obviously, Russian actors, whether it's Wagner Group, and if I may also point at many of the other actors that we know elsewhere, RT, Sputnik, some of the more traditional actors that are quite heavily involved in West Africa, and mostly West Africa. All of those are contributing to redrawing the maps of what the mainstream narratives are. So, for example, anti-French sentiment, much linked to anti-Western, anti-colonial sentiment, has been present in most of the continent for many, many years. Now, what these actors are doing is they are amplifying, they are giving the tools for those messages to be more prevalent. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, for example, is the role of some TikTokers and influencers in West Africa that speak to a Pan-African, a French-speaking Pan-African audience that are using some of these narratives of, well, democracy has failed to us, the French have failed to us, it's time for a change. And that change could come in many different shapes. And one shape it's coming is, well, Russia has tried to redraw the map in West Africa. Well, why don't we give them a try? So in that sense, those are useful cases that Russia can use to say, well, if you want to try something else, why don't you try us? Now, what I wouldn't draw a direct connection between the rise of military coups in West Africa, it's not caused because of Russian disinformation. But Russian disinformation is exploiting those grievances that are created because of that. And so, yeah, that's what I would say to your point.
John.
You've just referred to the use of traditional media like RT and Sputnik, but then amplified by influencers and by TikTok. I mean, can you say the extent to which social media is driving this? And, you know, is it on other platforms as well as TikTok, like Telegram or Facebook, etc.?
So we have to remember that in most of the continent, the main source of information is still traditional media, whether it's radio, TV, newspapers, absolutely not. So for the majority of people over the age of 45, social media is not in a role, right? Younger people, definitely. Recent data from the Oxford Reuters Institute said that anywhere between 60 and 70% of young people in Kenya, in Nigeria, get their news from YouTube, for example. So YouTube is an incredibly important source of information. And these actors are very good at marketing their content towards those spaces. Think of China. For a while, CGTN was top on the number of international broadcasters in terms of users.
Are you talking about repeating information that's been originally on RT, or is it user-generated content?
It's a combination of both. For example, both RT and CGTN have programs for what they call non-professional journalists. They offer them resources to tell their stories, and those stories, or the ones that get told, tend to be those aligned with both Moscow and Beijing. But then also there's a lot of more grassroots, so to speak, influencers. There's a very well-known case, Natalie Yam, for example, a Cameroonian with a Swiss passport. She's very well-known in Francophone Africa. She has very strong anti-French discourses, and those are very popular among the youth. She's pushed repeatedly for French troops and French resources to be out of West Africa, and then she repeats a lot of the Russian narratives, which again are nothing new. Antonio was talking about Russians being away for 20 years. All of these starts in the Cold War period, right? Both Russia and China had very huge presence on the continent. Both Russia and China had radio broadcasts in all the local languages, and that knowledge is actually quite important. China has non-stop broadcasting in Swahili since 1964. Russia had huge operations in Hausa, in Igbo, for example. So that knowledge is still there. And that presence back then was using the same narratives. The West is bad. The West is a colonial force. You have to fight against those values. And that's the repeated narratives that we see today. So there's nothing new in that space. And your question was about platforms, YouTube, TikTok. There's a well-known TV station funded by Russian actors called Afrique TV, and which is very active in putting forward very pro-Russian narratives. They use a lot of discussion-based. You could think a bit of like GB News for African audiences, if that helps as an example. And those are broadcasting primarily on social media. And then they get amplified on satellite dishes, for example, something that I think it's important for people to remember that in the African media space, there's three main broadcast providers for satellite dishes. One is French, Canal Plus. One is South African, DSTV. The third one is Chinese owned. It's called Star Times. When both Canal Plus and DSTV took down RT after the invasion of Ukraine and due to the pressure from mostly European actors, Star Times kept RT there. Star Times has Afrique TV on its free-to-air packages. So that infrastructure is there for those channels to be distributed. And even though there's no clear link between or clear cooperation between Russian and Chinese actors, both of them have similar goals, and those goals are discrediting Western actors and promoting their own views, and those views are increasingly aligned on what the world should look like.
Thanks.
Thank you. So all of these disinformation networks, the various different channels they're using, I mean, it's clear, I think, that France is a target of a lot of the stuff in West Africa. But how much do you think these are affecting perceptions of Africans towards France, towards the West more generally, and maybe towards institutions like the UN and NATO?
So if we take Russian propaganda in West Africa, it's exploiting sentiments that were already there. Right? So when we talk about anti-French sentiment in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Cote d'Ivoire, it's nothing new. It's been there for a long time. It might have been less mainstream, and then some of these platforms and some of these efforts by Russian actors, and to less extent Chinese, has increased the space that those narratives have to be in the mainstream. But some of the research that we've done, for example, has shown that it's not so much that people get exposed to those narratives through Russian channels that makes them feel stronger about them. It's just that they were already there, and it's just like the spark that's needed for people to remember, oh, well, through my 25 years of life, I've seen the French around. Nothing has changed in my country. So if anybody comes and tells me, well, you've been looking there, but you should be looking over there, well, that makes a lot of sense. And so I guess it's less about them being very effective in using the channels that they have to distribute the narratives, but it's just giving a voice for something that was subdued to some extent. And now those voices are becoming more mainstream. And you can think of a lot of what's happening in Western Europe to be similar. When Chinese or Russian actors come with a information manipulation campaign in Western Europe, all they do is they uncover or they give space for voices that had been in the background, and those voices become mainstream. And when they become in the mainstream, then the popularity is difficult to stop.
Is there any polling on this sort of stuff? Is there anything that we could get a tangible, evidence-based feel of it?
I think in the evidence that I submitted, the written evidence, I provided one study that we did in 4 countries: Angola, Zambia, Ethiopia, and South Africa. And we show there, for example, the popularity of certain Russian narratives when Russia said that the invasion of Ukraine was because of NATO. And we show statistically that those are very popular narratives. In Ethiopia, 70% of the population say that it's NATO's fault. Now, we try to trace why is it that 70% of Ethiopians think that. It's not because they watch Chinese sources. It's not because they watch Russian sources. It's mostly connected to the fact that those narratives activate a anti-colonial sentiment that is very prevalent in society. And Ethiopian media, for example, during the war in Ukraine, constantly had anti-West, anti-US sentiments. And those are a lot more locally, domestically embedded. You have to remember that when that happened, Ethiopia was going through internal conflict. And in that internal conflict, a lot of the blaming was done towards the US. Right? In the Ethiopian war with the Tigrays, for example, in the domestic public opinion, the government used the US as a scapegoat, saying, oh, the US is to blame for what's happening in Ethiopia. So there's already a very prevalent space for anti-Western sentiments.
And also Ethiopia is very proud of the fact that it was never conquered.
Very much
so.
All
of the countries in Africa remained independent. So the sort of anti-colonial instinct is very deep, I think.
Yeah, and it happens in many countries across the continent. I think we tend to downplay a little bit up here in Europe how long-lasting the effects of colonial rule were, and how many societies are significantly poorer than they should be had there not been colonial rule. And therefore, that is a sentiment that cannot be washed away. It's a sentiment that's there. And in a battle of narratives where you have the West portraying democracy as the solution to all the problems, and that democracy not delivering in the way that many citizens want, and then other actors saying, oh, well, the West has been lying to you. They've been here for 100 years. They've made you worse than you should be. It's time to try something else. In that space, that something else becomes quite attractive.
Yeah. Phil?
Thank you, Chair. I'm particularly interested in the money behind some of this. So I've got two questions, perhaps starting with Dr. Giustozzi, if I may, which is, you talked about the commercial nature of some of the disinformation and the activity that is taking place in Africa. Are you able to give us a sense of how much money Russia, as an example, is putting into a certain African country to propagate disinformation? The reason I ask that is we're having discussions against the context of the backdrop of funding for the likes of the British Council, the BBC World Service. So just be curious to know if there was any information you were able to share on that.
But the information is very fragmentary, and we did hear, but this is from Wagner Group sources, so you might want to take it with a pinch of salt. But in general, I think that the sources proved to be reliable in terms of the things they're telling us. And at least for a period, the disinformation branch in St. Petersburg was operating, was basically funded at the rate of around $10 million a month, but not only for Africa, that was the entire budget. So how much that would be for Africa is a bit difficult to say, but what we hear about payments made to journalists, we're talking about thousands of dollars, more than tens of thousands, or huge sums. Of course, in Africa, even thousands of dollars can be quite a significant amount, and for media houses, tens of thousands. So, in aggregate, and we have to consider that the Russians are really focused on Francophone Africa, not necessarily just the Sahel, of course, Central Africa, but also other Francophone countries, maybe sometimes broadcasting from there, mainly having in mind the Sahel. I do think that strategically they are more interested in the Sahel than any other part of Africa. We're probably talking some millions of dollars in terms of, total volume of operation, without counting their own staff, because of course, even for Russians, deploying personnel, even people working in the media sector, like advising or helping, is quite expensive, of course. Not as expensive maybe as for us, but anyway, they need to go there, they need to stay somewhere, and nobody's going to deploy to Africa from Russia for a few $100 a month, right? So you have to pay substantial salaries to even the limited staff you have on the ground, and then of course you have to spend money on the kind of administrative structure you have back in St. Petersburg to handle this. So I think in terms of money spent on the ground, we are talking about a few millions per year. I don't think it's a huge amount of money, but importantly, carefully targeted, strategically targeted. So I think one thing I would say is certainly Wagner Group operation in the media field, we are considered a little bit like a military campaign, like with a clear strategy in mind, with certain aims in mind, and focus on what really matters, on the achievements that have to be there in order to meet the request of the clients, which were not necessarily the Russian state, because some of the contracts were with the African governments. The Malian government, for example, they had contracts with Wagner Group to provide a certain type of information support. In this case, supporting the government. Other contracts have been about strengthening the image of Russia. There would be Russian contracts. So, I think they had a number of different contracts with different actors, not just with the Russian MOD.
And sticking on the topic of the finances, the UK government's imposed sanctions on African Initiative and 3 key individuals associated with it in July of this year, and those sanctions comprise asset freezes and a travel ban. How effective do both of you believe the UK government and international initiatives have been in terms of sanctioning some of the individuals and the organisations that are responsible for spreading disinformation in Africa, and what more do you think could be done to temper some of those movements?
May I go first?
Sure.
Well, I think this kind of initiatives, of course, I would say nuisance to Wagner Group or similar actors. Clearly, it is possible to circumvent any sanction simply, for example, replacing people. You know, they have redundant human resources. So I think that I don't know whether there are that many individuals that need to be involved in a specific operation in Africa. You know, they could be rotated in and out as needed. In the early stages, there are some Africa, especially Russians, who played an important role. I'm not sure whether now they are still that important. Anyway, there are quite a few, of course, Africa specialists in Russia. There are a number of universities that have this kind of expertise. So I think they have sufficiently redundant human resources to adapt. Of course, at the cost, so there will be a cost for them to adapt, but I think it's feasible for them to adapt.
My answer will be totally ineffective and probably sending the wrong message. My view on ways in which the UK or European partners can counter foreign interference is not by disrupting those spaces, mostly because that sends the message that we are ready to intervene in a sovereign information space, which is something that we would not like to have done on our own space. The opposite, or the counter-argument, or what should be done instead, is invest more heavily in presenting our own view of the world to those that are being targeted by Russians, Chinese, Turkish, and so on. And obviously, the main way in which the UK can do that is to the BBC. I know that probably the committee would agree that the BBC is clearly underfunded in its efforts to spread its message around the world. Something that I like to remind everybody is when we ask in polls, what is the number one source of information for you, BBC comes first, across most of Africa, right? Recent polling that we did in Ethiopia, Angola, Zambia, and South Africa, BBC came first in all 4 countries. So
is that BBC radio, television, social media?
It's a mix, right? So a lot of these people get content on social media, and it's difficult to trace whether it's specifically TV, it's specifically radio, or purely online content. And the BBC has done a lot of rethinking of its Africa strategy towards web-based. They have a very active web page that updates content regularly. So it is true.
They've told us about that, so it's just nice to get it confirmed by you.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And it's a brand that BBC has, as somebody who's not British, I'm Spanish, and I come here from with my Spanish background. BBC has a very bad reputation within the country, but not outside the country. BBC is seen as a symbol of freedom of the press, of freedom of speech, and those are the values that I think the UK could export a lot more actively. The way to counter Russians saying that the West is bad is not by shutting them down, not by telling them you have to have sanctions and you have to go and leave these countries, by saying, no, that's your story, let me tell you mine. But we are not doing a good job at telling our story. And when I say our, is any country that feels that Western values and democracy and freedom of the speech is the foundations of what we want to tell the world. So your point was, is it effective? No, it's not. And it's not because both Russia, China, Turkey, and any other actors have already built an infrastructure through which they can distribute their content by so many different means that you shut down one of these sources, there will be others. And instead, just let's invest more in getting the UK's position to the world, but also supporting local voices that are probably quite willing to tell a story different from the Chinese or the Russian one, but don't have the resources to do so. And it's, I guess, a difficult story to sell to a domestic audience, say, in a time of cuts, let's invest more in how other countries are telling their own stories. But it's a long-term game, and I think it's important for us to remember that the Chinese, the Russians, the Turkish, the Emiratis, the Saudis are in the long end game, Russia's investing heavily in training African journalists, in creating new channels for its information to be distributed. The Chinese are doing the same, while most European actors are doing the opposite. We're shutting down offices, we're shutting down language services, we're narrowing the space for newsrooms to operate. So we're going completely different directions, and that sends the wrong message.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I know that we have at least 4 questions. So if it's possible to compress the answers, I'd greatly appreciate it, because we're all going to have to run off. But Alex has a couple of questions.
Thank you. I was going to ask kind of the question you just answered, which is how can we counter these disinformation narratives? Now, I agree that the BBC and the committee agrees, I think, strongly that the BBC is an excellent way of doing that. Are there any other approaches? Some people have suggested digital literacy, homegrown African media that is more independent. Is there anything like that might also be helpful?
Media literacy has become as one of these areas that people like to fund, the same thing as fact-checking and debunking and things like that. While some of these are effective, I don't think that's the solution that we need to go for. Media literacy has been shown to sometimes have the counter effect. When we tell people so regularly, you have to be careful with what information you're consuming, you might move them from being critical consumers to very cynical consumers, and that's the opposite that you want to reach. Things that are a lot more efficient are investing in the resource, the media organizations that are already there, BBC, for example, but also I think making the UK public and UK companies more aware that information is a good area to invest in these days. When there's a new tender, for example, many African countries are still transitioning from analog to digital TV, which is something that we did 20 years ago. In those tenders, we never see European companies entering there. The Chinese have done most of these transitions, and that means that it's a Chinese company, StarTimes, that owns the infrastructure through which most African countries get their TV today. It is a lot more effective if we sell our companies and our stakeholders, look, that's an area where you should be investing more. And that includes Reuters, that includes Sky. We have all these actors that have a good brand, that have a good infrastructure, and they're not doing enough business in Africa.
Okay. John.
You've just mentioned China. I'm going back to our earlier session about Chinese activity. Can you just say very quickly the extent to which China is a player alongside Russia in this? And is it are they pursuing similar objectives, and how should we deal with it?
China is the biggest player on the continent by far. China is different from Russia in that it doesn't do disinformation as much, as the other session pointed out. It does a lot more PR and marketing and propaganda that is favorable towards China. And the key difference is that China has built an infrastructure across the continent to broadcast its messages through so many different platforms that no other actor has this ability. China obviously has CGTN, Xinhua, China Daily that we know of, but it also has all these partnerships and agreements with a lot of local actors. I always like to give one example that is very telling. If you go to a small country like Lesotho, for 4 hours a day, the national broadcaster switches off and broadcasts CGTN. Those 4 hours used to be for the BBC. For the BBC. The BBC used to be the choice for those 4 hours. On Kenya, national TV, 9 p.m., primetime news, they switch on to CGTN. That's a slot that used to be for CNN. That infrastructure that China has, no other country has, and we are not doing enough to counter those spaces. We've retrieved from the African market, other actors have entered.
Absolutely.
Yes. Ed, I'm sorry, Afra.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you about the counter-Daesh communication cell, which the UK leads on to undermine propaganda in parts of Africa, and I believe in also the Middle East and Afghanistan. I just wondered how effective you think it's been in kind of building that resilience against terror and extremist narratives.
I don't think it has been very effective. In general, in recent years, there's been a lot of backlash and criticism towards any kind of counter-narrative approach. And the main problem, essentially, in Africa is a narrative. because at least if you want to counter somebody's narrative, you need to have a good alternative narrative. It's not very easy now when you look at, especially Muslim Africa. For example, you could have you could support some media operation. Probably if you supported some media operation, you would want them to talk about Gaza in a certain way, but the public there doesn't want that kind of talk. They want answers. Mm-hmm. And that's why when you try to counter Daesh, what do you say about Gaza? Do you have a narrative that can compete with this? It's an example, I say Gaza, but I could say something else. They're very weak on messages that can be appealing to the kind of public that Daesh targets, which is not necessarily, the man in the street. So I think in general this approach is quite discredited. Of course, it's not easy to say. We at RUSI are trying to develop other ways of dealing or bypassing the narrative dimension altogether, and we have tried to pilot it in some projects we have done. But I think still we are quite a long way from having kind of consensus on, what the effective approach would be.
I mean, are there things that you think it could do to be more effective or to work more collaboratively with kind of legitimate, like local security partners and things like that to improve its effectiveness?
There are ways of doing it, but the problem is that there are not many countries where it's easy to find local partners. Mm-hmm. Also because, of course, if you involve them, you also expose them to risk, right? So that's one issue. So, for example, if you use some people in the media sector and if they're seen as collaborating, they could be a target. In some environment, the danger could be very real, not only from Daesh, but also from other actors. So that's a problem. We do think that there is potential, I think what my colleague was saying earlier, there's potential in the media resilience field. I think it's not realistic to think that we can educate the entire public in media resilience, but perhaps targeting a certain sector of the public that, the public that does aspire to a good quality information, or there is a market even in Africa for specialist publication, for example, in the business sector, in the defense sector, So perhaps investing on that, where there is demand, offer something that they can appreciate. And this is the middle class, essentially, the professional class and the business class, who of course are very important, not so much in terms of numbers, so they wouldn't affect necessarily the outcome of an election, but any government needs to work with these guys, needs to rely on them, because there will be the people who are fixing things for you, the people that run the government, the people who, like the business sector, you need to have them on board. So perhaps there is space there. I think an investment targeting this public and helping or making sure that they have the kind of information they need would be useful. So the BBC is very useful, but I think there's also demand for specialist information, like business, defense, security. You see there are some actors there, but clearly much of the demand is not being met.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming today and for sharing your expertise and information with us. We've heard some pretty startling evidence this morning. If you have any further thoughts after this session, you think there are questions we should have asked you, or there's extra information now you know the approach we're taking and that you think that we might need to know, please do write to us and share us any further thoughts. And may I thank you again